Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm Dr. Pamela Crisco. I am a founding board member of the Psychedelic Association of Canada. I've been here right from the beginning, so it's quite an honor for me to be here with you today and really appreciating you all joining today. As we let everyone get in and get settled, I want to thank Gordon for being our tech host today and for all he does to keep us organized for these webinars. And I want to thank all the volunteers at the Psychedelic Association of Canada. We have an amazing group of people that do all sorts of things, from the social media to behind the scenes organization, to these webinars, to the newsletter. It's a mostly 99.9% volunteer run organization. And so we really appreciate your membership support, which goes to running webinars like this, plus all the advocacy work we do for you on your behalf. We talk to policymakers, we talk to politicians, we speak at conferences. We really push forward, us wanting to make sure that, everything around psychedelics, education around psychedelics is available. And essentially that, access to these visionary medicines are really your birthright. So hopefully we can move that forward. Really appreciate it. We have some amazing events coming up in the near future. We have some webinars lined up for April. We've got planetary rebirth and climate resilience with a couple guests there joining there. And then we have Healing Beyond the Lines with the retired firefighter and cluster busters, Joe McKay, that's coming. And a state of psychedelic law in Canada, another update on where are we now. Always promises to be a vigorous discussion. And so that's what's coming. And again, thanks to all the volunteers at the PAC that help all this go so smoothly. And so with that, I feel very thrilled and honored that we have Dr. Florian Birkmayer with us today to talk about sense and psyche. I think you're going to be in for a delightful treat. I've had the privilege of hearing him and his partner speak many times and always learn something. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Florian, to introduce yourself. And then after Florian is done, we'll open it up for Q&A after that. Welcome.
Great. Well, thank you. First, thank you for having me. And also thank you, Pam, for inviting me. And thank you, Gordon, for the tech. And welcome, everyone. I can't see people, but that's okay. I'm just going to talk. I'm Florian Birkmayer. I'm an MD. I did my medical school at Columbia, did my psychiatry residency training at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque back from 2000 to 2004, and was a real sort of keeper of the faith, wanted to be the best in psychiatry, and then kind of had this awakening, I always think of it as the naked lunch moment, that book by William Burroughs, the naked lunch is when you look at the end of your fork and you realize there's, a living thing there. So I became really disturbed by psychiatric diagnosis, psychiatric medications, how disabling they are. That's a whole nother conversation. But throughout my life, I'd worked with aromas myself. I started a private practice back in 2009, where I was really able to, people found me who had really been damaged by the system, let's say. And in that context, I was starting to work with aromas. I very early on started working with ketamine, back in 2010. And always with aromas. So over time, I've really appreciated the unique magic that aromas bring to psychedelic works. I like to think that aromas, and by aromas, I often say aromas because it's fewer syllables than saying essential oils by scent only. But it's really when we smell natural aromas, all these things happen, and it's really our birthright. So I just want to share with you today all the levels of synergy that there's evidence for, that I've experienced, and then we can take it further from there. Let me share my screen. I'm going to share this presentation. If anybody can't see it, just maybe
looks great.
let some. Great. So this is just a title sheet. But what am I hoping to do today is really cover the evidence for the multiple levels of synergy. That's really the theme. It's not just, oh yeah, that smells nice. It's really at all these different levels, really from the molecule to the cosmic awareness, psychedelics and aromas. And again, by aromas, I mean natural aromas that evolved in plants, and I'll spell that out more. How they synergize, and then how hopefully that will make you appreciate how aromas uniquely enhance psychedelic therapy. And I really want to, for those of you who either do psychedelic therapy or are on your own journeys with psychedelics, I really hope you can you're encouraged or inspired to incorporate aromas. And maybe many of you already do. And just the number one limitation I want to mention is that we're on Zoom. So we can, I wish I could share scent strips with you, but that's just not possible in this setting. There are other ways that I'll discuss. Okay, so this is just sort of a roadmap. We're going to go from the molecule, the brain level, interpersonal, community, ecosystem, collective soul. First, I want to cover how scent works on all these levels. And on the molecule, the scent molecules, a lot of plants that are aromatic actually make a lot of the same molecules. You could think of it almost like an aromatic alphabet. Um, we'll get more into that, but there's sort of these common alphabet letters, molecules that many plants make. Some of them are unique to individual plants, but the fact that all these different plants make overlapping sets of molecules to me is fascinating. It's this shared language that these molecules travel through the air. We'll go into it more. I just sort of want to shout out, but there's several different families of receptors that are involved in olfaction, and several of these are also involved in where we think psychedelics act. On the brain level, we'll get there in more detail. I just want to plant the seed for the piriform cortex. Some of you may know that. We'll go into more detail. Some of you may have heard of the default mode network. On the interpersonal level, there's something what I would call biographical. We're going to talk about connectedness. I'm going to mention the Keteret. It's both the culture. Keteret is the ancient Hebrew incense. It's spelled out in the Torah as a very precise recipe that you're only allowed to burn in the temple, and when you smell it, you're in the presence of the divine. So there's this, of course, cultural dimension of that, but also, being in the presence of the divine is not some non-material experience. You need a being in your body to smell, and smell is a very immanent experience. And then we'll talk about how scent connects us to the ecosystem. Okay, so what's an essential oil? For some of you, you may know this already, I apologize. But basically, it's not an essential oil until a human distills it. So the traditional stills are steam-based. There are proto-stills already in ancient Egypt, and then modern still designs evolved over the last few hundred years. But in the plant, you can't really say it's the essential oils, and not all plants make aromatic molecules. The flip side of that is that those plants who make aromatic molecules are the most chemically diverse organisms. So if I made a list, or if we looked at a list of all the different types of chemicals we humans have, the hemoglobin in our blood, the albumin in our serum, the proteins in our muscles, instead of looking at quantity, just saying how many different ones there are, we are made up of about 3,000 different molecules. And some of these plants are made up of 20 to 50,000 different molecules. So they're these chemical powerhouses. They're just these incredible beings that synthesize all these different molecules. And so why were these aromatic molecules, these volatile aromatic molecules that they travel through the air and we can smell them, why were they evolved? Why did plants evolve them? There's a lot of evolutionary explanation to me is always sort of anthropocentric projection, but the idea was in the early life, when the early life forms emerged, plants evolved these to compete with fungi and bacteria. So, and a lot of these essential oils have antifungal, antibacterial properties. There's also intraspecies communication. Many examples of this: if a insect or other pest eats or attacks one plant of a family, of a stand of plants, that plant will release volatiles who warn the other plants, and often the other plants will change their chemical makeup to be less palatable to the predator. there's also much more complex interplay. Like there's certain grass-like plants that sheep eat, and if they get overgrazed, they make more estrogen or estrogen-like compounds that then make the sheep less fertile. So then in the future generations, there's fewer sheep. It gets really intricately interrelated. But what I'm already implying is really a cross-species communication. Around 250 million years ago, flowering plants evolved at the same time as pollinating, mostly insects. There are other pollinators, but the idea was like, what's the one thing plant can't do is locomotion, and wind pollination is very inefficient. So plants figured out ways through flowers, through nectar, through molecules that travel through the air that let's take bees, can smell, so that they go from flower to flower and help pollinate. So you could say in a way we're glorified pollinators, that our relationship to plants, you could say, look at it from the human point of view, oh, we use plants for this, but you could also say, well, how have plants manipulated us, or how are we in the service of plants? I call these olfactory molecules, they're essential as the molecules of connectedness, because it's more than just, oh, this plant smells weird, I shouldn't eat that. That smells lovely, I'm going to eat that. We're constantly immersed in our entire beings and brains evolved over millennia in a world full of aromas. And again, we have receptors in our brain. We'll get into that in a minute. So we're in this deep connectedness with these molecules, or through the molecules of connectedness with all these beings around us. And, you could argue that the cutoffness, that to me is really the hallmark of modern humans, the shared disease most of us have is being cut off, is really because we've forgotten how to smell. There's an intriguing line in Freud and Civilization, and it's this contents in a footnote. He says, when we were, for our four-legged ancestors, their nose was in front of them and the scent was their primary sense. And once we started moving upright, vision became our primary sense. And that's all he says, no further explications. It's frustrating, but it's something to think about. When did things change? The other reason I like essential oils, and I'll just say there is an environmental concern. There are many plants that are endangered. There are companies making essential oils from endangered plants. And even the production of essential oils is impacting non-endangered plants and ecosystems. Nevertheless, and we really only work with really high quality, small batch, artisanally distilled essential oils, but they're stable. I can work with aromas from plants that don't grow this season. It's March, nothing's flowering yet. I can use plants from around the world. And, what makes us unique, you and me, we have more or less the same liver, more or less the same skeleton, more or less the same spleen, let's say. But what makes us unique is our personalities. You could, in a way, think that the aromas is sort of the unique personality of the plant. It's a little more collective, of course, because, plants of the same species usually make more or less the same essential oils. I mean, that's actually not exactly true, but the uniqueness of a plant is in its scent, not in its chlorophyll or in its other structural molecules like lignin. How aromas touch us. I talked about the molecules of connectedness. We talked about how they evolved. There's this interesting guy, David Abram. He calls himself a philosopher of nature, and you can go on YouTube. He gave a presentation at the Harvard Center for Divinity some years ago called The Commonwealth of Breath. And he talks about what connects us all. The first thing we do when we're born is inhale. The last thing we do when we die is exhale. And the air we breathe, we're all sharing. And in fact, the oxygen we breathe is made by plants. A lot of the life forms that first emerged on the planet were killed by all the oxygen that the blue-green algae made. Nevertheless, my point is that these volatile molecules travel through the air and connect us. So maybe it's a geeky way of looking at it, but they're like the neurotransmitters of the world's soul. Going from the molecule to the receptor level, olfactory receptors is a superfamily. So there are different subfamilies within it. And we have over 400 genes in our genome coding for olfactory receptors. And they occur in every organ and in multiple areas of the brain, not just the olfactory system. So when you think, oh, I'm just smelling with my olfactory system, that's not true. Your entire body is reacting. One example is the way the sperm finds its way to the egg is that the egg releases certain aromatic molecules in the sperm have olfactory receptors in their tip. And in fact, scent is the oldest sense evolutionarily. Single-celled organisms have chemoreceptors where they will grow or move towards food sources and away from things that are toxic to them. But going back to the 400 genes, to me, that's not garbage. That's not tag along. If we have evolutionarily preserved 400 genes, they're obviously important. So just one way to think about it. There's another family of receptors. I don't want to geek out, but they're called transient potential receptor channels. The word channel sometimes gets dropped. So when you smell mint or taste mint tea, and there isn't just the mint flavor, but also the sensation of cooling, it's because the mint molecules, the menthol, tricks one of the transient potential receptors that normally detects changes in temperature, coolness, and chemically triggers it through the molecule does. So you think mint is cool. The analogous thing is with capsaicin, the ingredient in many chilies. They're not just spicy, but also temperature hot, because capsaicin triggers another kind of TPR, so that you think, oh, this is actually temperature hot. And there's many examples of that. And one reason I mentioned this, and there's a typo there, that abnormalities in these receptors appear to be involved in a variety of psychiatric disorders, anxiety, bipolar, substance abuse, and others. Okay, so going back, another level of receptor, and again, I'm sorry, I'm geeking out on this, is the trace amine associated receptors. We have 7 types in humans. Abnormalities, again, are found in a variety of psychiatric conditions, and several of them, well, at least type 1, which is the main one in the brain, binds some psychedelic molecules, but not all. So again, they are olfactorily triggered by certain olfactory molecules or aromatic molecules, but they're also triggered by certain psychedelic molecules. I mean, we could argue whether amphetamine and methamphetamine are psychedelic, but and I don't, I mean, this is, I don't know how many different psychedelic molecules they've tested. And again, not, for example, psilocybin and psilocin do not trigger the type 1 receptor. But again, another area of synergy. A couple things about how olfaction works. There's a slice of the brain on the right. It's not really green in nature, but this is an organ called the thalamus. I always think of it like 2 eggs between the brainstem, which in this view is from below, has been removed, and the new brain, the neocortex. And all our senses are filtered through the thalamus. So the reason you're not feeling the clothes in your skin right now is because the thalamus filters it out. Whereas if someone touches you, it'll distinguish. You can tell when someone's touching you, even if you're wearing clothes and you're not feeling your clothes. If we were in a crowded restaurant, you could focus on my voice. The thalamus filters out all the noise. The olfactory system doesn't go through the thalamus. It goes right into the olfactory bulb. I'm pointing above my nose. That's where the olfactory bulb is. We'll have a slide about that in a second. And it goes from there straight into the brain, or the rest of the brain, I should say. It doesn't go through the thalamus. So these filter mechanisms, why you're not feeling your clothes, why you could hear me in a crowded restaurant. And the other extreme example is, your eyes really only see what your brain tells them to see. There's actually neurons that go backwards onto your retina from the brain, but that doesn't happen in olfaction. That's why when we smell or when we're exposed to a scent, it touches us. We can't sort of filter it out. The other thing is that the olfactory bulb is actually, and I call it CN1, the first cranial nerve, is actually inside the blood-brain barrier. So that's something fascinating, that once these olfactory molecules are in there, again, in a way, there's no stopping them. And then very directly, here's the piriform cortex again, which we'll get back to. The piriform cortex in animals where scent is more primary, like rats and dogs, is called the olfactory association cortex. In analogy to, if you see a chair, even if you've never seen that particular chair before, you can sort of say it's a chair. Your brain puts together, well, it's indoors, it's a certain size, it's a certain shape, must be a chair. The same thing happens with learned scent objects. I'm sure it happens with humans. It's not as studied, but again, in rats and dogs, where olfaction is so much known to be more important. I mean, I think it's important for us too, obviously, but again, that's where the olfactory objects are formed. And let me just float this question. We can speculate about it at the end. Why do we have a sense of smell? And I think it's much more than just saying, oh, the milk's gone off. Okay, this is just quick anatomy. So again, you can see the smelling the rose, the olfactory bulb is right above our nose. The nerves go through this thing called the cribriform plate. And then the first step really from the olfactory bulb, so the aromatic molecules bind the olfactory bulb and immediately go to the piriform cortex and again, and then to other areas, hypothalamus, thalamus, um, limbic system. The limbic system, again, is involved in emotions. It's the reptilian brain. So that's often why people have these strong emotional reactions and memory reactions to scent. This is just a close-up. Let's skip that. This is a more abstract form. Again, my main point was the receptor cell that's in the cribriform plate. The bodies of the cells are in the olfactory bulb. It's just an end of the nerve endings. And I'll say at this point that, when you inhale, couple of things is they've done studies when you really sniff, like when you see animals like a dog sniffing, like when you can see your nostrils flaring, it actually changes how you process scent. So that's why dogs do it and why we can do it. And then immediately goes to the piriform cortex. And again, I know there's a lot of jargon, and then to other areas. Amygdala, you might be familiar, for those of you familiar with PTSD, the amygdala can be dysregulated in PTSD, misjudging misjudging threatening stimuli and triggering PTSD responses, including flight or fight. And no one talks about, oh, I had this smell experience, and that's why I got into a PTSD trigger. I think it's an overlooked area, and there's hippocampus, orbitofrontal cortex. So again, memory system, emotional reactions. I just put this in. There's actually a number of abnormalities in scent related to a variety of central nervous system illnesses. The first link, and I can share the PowerPoint with you, is a review. In many cases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, schizophrenia, you can measure olfactory dysfunction before any of the other symptoms appear. So I think that's really interesting. Then there's another article, I didn't bold it, but they mentioned that olfactory loss is associated with at least 139 medical conditions. So again, it's very widespread. And it's not just, oh, you lost your sense of smell, too bad. The flip side of that actually is also really interesting. So there's a study from about a year ago, well, 2 years ago now, July 23, that olfactory enrichment, where these elderly people had a diffuser by the side of the bed and smelled a rotating set of essential oils, improved memories, and they actually got brain scans, and it modified the uncinate fasciculus, which, if you ask me right now what that does, I don't know, but I think it's involved in cognition. And then also there's a review article about the effects of olfactory training, which again is a form of olfactory enrichment where you have different but very sort of firm protocols about how to smell that can help not just restore olfaction. So one role of olfactory training is in restoring loss of scent, COVID related or even before COVID, but it also changes cognition and brain function, and not just in people with mild cognitive impairment. Actually, the last one isn't a review article, it's a randomized control trial. There's a number of articles suggesting that depression and olfaction are interlinked. And I don't want to geek out too much, but the interesting thing is, and I mean, big asterisks, a lot of the medications that are posited at SSRIs and SNRIs, that's not really how they work. So, however, there is a study, it's the third one listed here, that the olfactory deficits of depressed patients can be treated with venlafaxine, which is an SNRI, it works on serotonin and norepinephrine. Be that as it may, but again, it's not just, oh, you lost your sense of smell, it's hopeless. There's actually exciting, promising perspectives on how to help people restore their sense of smell, restore their cognition, restore their brain function. How is scent perceived? Like a melody, really. So, there's a time code, so when you hear a melody, there's something, a note, and then another note, and then another note, and you can often sort of intuitively, what the next note should be. And if it's not that, it sounds off. And that sort of sequence over time in a much faster way is how we perceive sense. And the challenge is really, we live in a world full of scents. So how do we distinguish the foreground, what we're smelling, from the background? That's been a big subject of neuroscience research, how that happens. And the other thing is, again, I mentioned rats and dogs and how they form scent objects. we also form scent objects, a lot of them unconsciously, and a lot of this research on scent objects is actually by marketing companies. The stupid example for Dunkin' Donuts, the fact that the exhaust vent from the oven goes in front of the store is not an accident. People walk past, smell the donuts, and they're like, "Oh, I want a donut." But that's just a stupid example. There are many examples where they study this and how scent, often at levels below conscious detection, influence people's behavior. So a lot of these research papers come from an industry interested in getting us to change our behaviors based on what they want. So I think that's another reason to work on making our sense of scent a more conscious scent. Um, Okay, getting through it. Another level at which essential oils work, and again, it's sort of a sneak preview. Many of you may be familiar with the default mode network. It's posited that psychedelics work by deactivating the default mode network. Aromas do that too. The olfactory network and the default mode network are closely linked. Olfaction bypasses the intellect. When we smell something, it immediately changes our state. Their anxiolytic effects. I wrote an article, God, time passed, just back in 2018. It was a part of a book about integrative addiction and recovery. I'll skip this. The most important thing about the default mode network is it's really our ego, our story of our, I mean, ego is a psychoanalytic term, but our story of ourselves that we tell ourselves is really a program running in the default mode network. And of course, there's many abnormalities in the default mode network in a variety of psychiatric conditions. But even when there's nothing wrong with, nothing diagnosable with us, being stuck in default mode, being stuck in ego, to me, limits our way to be fully present, limits our way to be connected. Just real quick, a bunch of references about the fact that olfaction. So first of all, within the olfactory areas, we're constantly making new neurons and new connections. This has been applied for anosmia, which means the loss of sense of smell, which became very infamous during COVID, but it also can happen for other reasons. And there's olfactory training again. One mechanism of this might be through oxytocin, which again is a putative mechanism of how ketamine might benefit people. And again, smelling aromas, smelling essential oils has been shown to cause neuroplasticity, in particular the olfactory network. But in these studies, they didn't really look at other areas of the brain. The effects of aromas are both physiological and psychological. The molecules of connectedness, I wrote about in an article. Just a shout out again, getting ahead of ourselves. There's a study that black pepper essential oils, smelling it reduces cigarette craving. It's from the 90s. And when Matt Johnson did his study on using psilocybin for tobacco cessation, he actually used black pepper essential oil. And it's not well spelled out in the protocol, frustratingly, but it was certainly part of the intervention. There's all sorts of review articles. Just the last thing I'll mention, it's not really related to what I want to talk about, but aromas are extremely powerful. There's a neurosurgeon in Brazil, Da Fonseca, who for years now has demonstrated that when his clients with inoperable brain tumors called gliomas, it's a very nasty form of brain tumor, if they smell perilla essential oil, and perilla is beefsteak mint, often these tumors can be shrunk and people can keep the tumors at a very small size for years by keeping smelling them. Then they tried actually giving it as a chemotherapy drug orally, and I think IV, and people had intolerable side effects. And again, when you smell, the number of molecules in your bloodstream are more or less undetectable, and yet they are powerful enough to shrink these gliomas. So just something to think about how powerfully aromas can touch us. Going up on the next level, the interpersonal level, some of you may be familiar with the French 19th century writer Marcel Proust, who wrote a 3,500 page, thinly veiled autobiographical novel. That's the best translation of the title would be In Search of Lost Time, but a big famous translation is called Remembrance of Things Past. And it starts with him having a cookie, and our taste is mostly smell. And the smell of this cookie reminds him of a cookie he had as a child at his aunt's house. And then he gets this massive download of all the stories of his life. And he describes it very, I have a little bit of a paragraph here, but in the passages, the paragraphs before, he talks about how scent memory is different. It's not like remembering when I say what's 2 + 2 or what's your phone number. He talks about how you sort of get these goosebumps and a vague feeling, and you really have to sort of surrender to the experience. And then the scent will take you to these places, which again is quite analogous to the psychedelic experience, you could say. And then this ends in this paragraph: when from a long distance past, nothing subsists after the people are dead, after the things are broken, more fragile, but with more vitality, more unsubstantial, more persistent, the smell and taste of things remains poised for a long time, like souls ready to remind us. So again, this memory function of scent, I'm not going to read the whole quote, is just so profound. And again, I think that's only one level at which scent works. Um, Keeping going at the community level, I don't want to linger on too much, but there are certain culture-bound shared community scents. If I say Christmas, I'm sure you can evoke certain scents in your imagination. And the example that I just can't get out of my head, and I don't know if it's the same in Canada, but pumpkin spice latte is all over now. I mean, at first it's a completely synthetic scent, and it's become like this placeholder for season. It's pumpkin spice latte season, the Starbucks ad will say. So it's sort of, again, there's marketing, but there's a shared cultural scent that tells people, oh, it's the time, it's fall, it's time for a pumpkin spice latte. There's many other examples, but that one just really annoys me. We talked about the cultural level, the Keteret in the Torah. You can only smell it when you're in the temple. It's a very precise recipe. For those of you familiar with ayahuasca ceremonies or other shamanic traditions in South America, there are the Agua de Florida and Palo Santo, and perfumeros are actually shamans that specialize in working with scent. And I would argue, based on my experience with a variety of essential oils and people we've taught around the world, and people in South America react similar to people in Taiwan to scents they've never been exposed to. So I think there's a very primal, I'm a Jungian, so I feel like archetypal, this beyond learned scent objects, beyond pumpkin spice latte and other things we've learned, sense touches at this very deep level. And I think that's been at the root of many spiritual traditions. The masters of this were really the ancient Egyptians. Um, you know, Scent was everywhere. They were known for their perfumery and cosmetics. And it wasn't just, oh, I want to smell nice, on this you look pretty. It was really a deeply spiritual practice. The upper slide, you can see the gentleman in green with the white crown. That's Osiris, who really became the archetypal pharaoh, the blueprint for all pharaohs. And in fact, you can see it. He's holding an instrument. So there's the crook, that curved thing, which is the origin of the Catholic bishop's crook. And the other thing is often called a flail, but I've seen the original articles already 100 years ago. It was very well described as a ladeniferum, an instrument for dragging through cistus bushes to collect this aromatic resin that we've learned through working with ourselves, working with people, is really the master of shadows. And so in a way, the pharaoh's job is really to be confronted with the shadow. Even the beard that Osiris is wearing, it's a stylized beard. Many pharaohs were clean shaven and then would stick on these fake beards that were usually had labdanum in them, which is, now you may have heard of labdanum men's beard grooming products. A lot of young men have beards now, and labdanum will be in some of them. But again, that's sort of a very superficial misunderstanding. It was really like, if the beard is a very fancy system of delivering scent, the pharaoh is constantly having to look at their shadow issues. And of course, the ultimate shadow realm is the realm of the dead. And Osiris, gets killed by his brother, dismembered, dies, comes back, dies again, which is, sort of a version of the story that also appears in the Christian tradition. Blue lotus, so the ladies in this replica are holding blue lotus flowers. Blue lotus, interestingly, some of you may know, is a psychedelic and aromatic, and it's actually in some of the versions of the Egyptian cosmology is really the first thing that happens. Father's earth and mother sky, they have the gender different. They get together and their child is the blue lotus. So the first thing that happens in the origin of the universe is the creation of the blue lotus, who is also a deity. So again, scent was extremely important, deeply interlinked in the Egyptian spirituality. Um, let's talk about immanence and connectedness. I mentioned it before. Well, actually, let's talk about that when we talk about psychedelics. Um, for me, the fact that the unconscious and the collective unconscious exist is not a matter of belief. I just firmly know it. But I realize that these are certain terms. Some people call the collective unconscious the transpersonal realm. That's fine. I would say soul, there's an individual soul and the collective soul. And again, sense operates at this level, at really a soul to soul level. And this isn't just scent object. This isn't just something you learn. This is very deep. But again, unfortunately, the way a lot of essential oils are made now are mass produced, fractionated, often they're sort of dead and their soul is destroyed. And you really need the small batch artisanally produced oils that really have that aliveness. Okay, let's how aromas and psychedelics synergize. Again, all these levels. I'll skip this because we're going to talk about it. So there's this, to me, surprising and profound similarity between aromatic and psychedelic molecules. First of all, there's a book on the right that some of you may know, several editions, Plants of the Gods, Their Sacred Healing and Hallucinogenic Powers, edited by Schultes, Hoffman, and Retsch, legends in the psychedelic field. And if you read this book, most of the chapters start with, the essential oil of this plant or the essential oil of that plant, like, without, well, I think they thought about it, they just didn't spell it out. But a lot of psychedelic plants are also aromatic plants. For those of you who are familiar with ketamine, which is getting very popular now, it was synthesized back in 1965, patented and FDA approved in 1970, and only a few years ago was it found in nature in a fungus in the Brazilian rainforest. We already talked about the use in ceremonies, but what's really interesting, sorry, so some of you may know Sasha Shulgin, who was this legendary chemist in the Bay Area who synthesized hundreds of psychedelic molecules. He rediscovered MDMA. He didn't invent it, but he really popularized its use, a bunch of other molecules. So he wrote two books, Pikal and Tikal. And Pikal, they're both sort of half autobiography and half recipes and experiences with all these molecules he invented. And in a footnote in Pikal, he mentions there's 10 essential oils that if you just change a carbon to a nitrogen, they go from being an aromatic molecule to a psychedelic molecule. And in fact, in his own life, Shulgin worked in essential oil research for many years before he left the corporate field and became a full-time psychedelic chemist. But to me, I'll spell out the examples. Sometimes I love chemical structures, but some people's eyes glaze over. But the footnote, Shulgin's footnote ends with him saying, nature is trying to tell us something. So the most famous example is, of course, on the left, saffrole, which is in sassafras and other plants, can be very easily converted to MDMA and MDA. You can see they're very similar, only this one carbon molecule, you add a nitrogen. And in fact, one of the nicknames of MDA is sass for the sassafras plant. And saffrole has, at least in the US, become, and I think around the world, become a scheduled compound because if you buy saffrole, you can very easily turn it into MDMA. So the authorities such as the DA think, oh, this guy's trying to buy saffron, is trying to make MDMA. The other example that's a little more obscure is L-amycin and mescaline and trimethylamphetamine. L-amycin occurs in certain aromatic plants. And the reason I mention it is because we distilled an aromatic plant that grows around here. And actually, while we're distilling it and the fumes were filling our home, had psychedelic experiences, and then we looked it up, and that's what led me down this rabbit hole. And again, L-amycin, there is actually, if you really dig down those internet rabbit holes, there are people who are trying to use L-amycin as a psychedelic, but the more famous psychedelic, of course, is mescaline. Okay, moving right along. So my point is that aromatic and psychedelic molecules are they're like cousins. They're like letters in the same alphabet. And as Philligan said, nature is trying to tell us something. This is not just, oh, it smells nice. We really, we're wired for both of these families of molecules. The research here is very spotty, but olfactory receptors, certain olfactory receptors, such as this, can be triggered by cannabinoids. And certain olfactory molecules will actually trigger cannabinoid receptors. So it goes both ways. I mentioned the transient potential receptors. They're the ones that are the mint cool, the capsaicin hot. They're also activated by THC, CBD, and CBN. And I got to tell you, I just haven't found research where they've tested other psychedelic molecules. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, these trace amine-associated receptors are stimulated, or at least one subfamily is stimulated by certain psychedelics. So again, these are all receptors that are, or receptor families to be more precise, that are stimulated by olfactory aromatic molecules and psychedelic molecules. So clearly an area of synergy. On the brain level, here's the piriform cortex. So as I said, the piriform cortex is the second step. You smell something, immediately the nerves from the olfactory bulb go to the piriform cortex. And the other thing that I'm telling you now is that the piriform cortex is covered in serotonin type 2A receptors. And serotonin type 2A receptors is the sort of agreed upon target of most classical psychedelics, LSD, psilocin, and DMT. You need, if you block this receptor, there's been a variety of studies, you don't really have a psychedelic experience. Is it sufficient? I think you can dig deeper, but again, you need it. And no one, to my knowledge, we're looking at serotonin type 2A receptors in other areas of the brain. There's very little research on what do psychedelics do to the olfactory system, but it's clearly another area of synergy. I mean, I have to admit it's a little daunting, but Robin Carhart Harris' this model of rebus relaxed belief under psychedelics. The S is for the second letter in the word psychedelics. The idea is that normally we have this top-down processing default mode network. Again, you're not feeling touch because the thalamus says ignore the clothes. That sort of top-down standard processing and relaxed beliefs under psychedelics is the idea that we're the habitual ways in which we process sensory input is opened up, dysregulated. You could sort of say what Huxley called the doors of perception. And I think the idea that olfaction is, or the piriform cortex, which is the olfactory association cortex, is covered in these receptors. Again, no one's really talking about it, but it's clearly, to me, an area of potential synergy. Keeping going, astrocytes. Astrocytes are these cells in the brain that look like stars, hence the name astrocytes. And for a long time, they were thought to be just structural cells. They're sort of scaffolding, and the neurons are in between, and the astrocytes are just what the neurons grow along. But for a number of years now, I would say easily 20 years now, it's been known that astrocytes are also involved in signaling, and they're involved both in olfactory signaling. So astrocytic activation increases blood flow in the olfactory bulb, clearly important. And then this paper is a little very detailed, but basically it's saying that astrocytes are required for scent processing. And conversely, there's a recent paper from just a few months ago in Neuron that you may have heard about, where they gave ketamine to zebrafish embryos. And what happens with zebrafish embryos, if you can give them this VR where you make them think they're swimming or not, by playing videos that make them think, oh, when I swish my tail, I swim. And if you make them feel like their swimming is futile, they very quickly give up. And you could say that's sort of a animal model of learned helplessness, maybe related to depression, to the sense of why bother. And the interesting thing is, if you give these zebrafish ketamine, they keep swimming. They don't give up. They have less of this induced futility. And the reason I'm telling you this is because this effect is actually mediated by astrocytes. And there's a number of other papers involving astrocytes and how depression and other things seem to impact us or relieved. And again, another area of synergy between olfaction and psychedelics, astrocytes. Sorry, it's maybe very superficial, but just another layer. Again, we've talked about the default mode network, but psychedelics have been shown to decrease the internal connectedness of the default mode network. So there's both a brain pathways that are indicative of the default mode network, and then sort of cognitive behavioral pathways. When you're sort of set in your ways, you're in these invisible ruts. And one mechanism of action, putative mechanism of action of psychedelics, there's papers for psilocybin, there's papers for ketamine that show that by making these internal connections of the default mode network weaker and making it more connected to other areas of the brain, that might be how psychedelics help us. Aromas do something similar. So clearly another area of synergy. They both cause neuroplasticity. So not just in the default mode network, but really in all areas of the brain. And both psychedelics and aromas really help us get out of the intellect, of the famous ego death or ego dissolution. And again, the ego to me is just a program running in the default mode network. And again, don't want to knock the ego. We need the ego, but it shouldn't convince us it's all there is and that nothing else matters. We talked about the community level at which aromas work. Psychedelics also work at this level. There's the Watts connectedness scale. Rosalind Watts validated the scale she was involved when Carhart Harris was still at Imperial College London. She measured connectedness among people, and it seems to be that connectedness is a key mediator of psychological well-being and might be a factor underlying how psychedelics help us. So again, it's not just psychedelics that connect us. I think this is an important effect of how psychedelics work, but aromas can obviously also connect us. And then there's even more specific than connectedness, which you could think of as interpersonal connectedness. I feel closer to you, I'm more open to you, I'm less judgmental, less projecting. But even nature connectedness, there's a young researcher, well, he's probably not that young anymore, Sam Gandy, who has specifically measured nature connectedness, and that a lot of the benefits of psychedelic administration appear to be similar and enhanced through nature connectedness. And obviously aromas also connect us more to nature. There's just more studies by Gandhi. I just want to read that one line. Psychedelics have the capacity to elicit a connection with nature that is passionate and protective, even among those who were not previously nature oriented. And so actually, I have to say that the word psychedelic to me is limited. The only reason I like it, honestly, is Humphrey Osmond, who was an early pioneer English psychiatrist who worked in Saskatchewan. And he coined the term psychedelic in a letter to Huxley when they were trying to figure out what should we call this thing. It's a better term than hallucinogen. I don't like the word entheogen because, again, it's still very self-inward absorbed. But over the last few years, more and more people have used the term ecodelic. And it's really, to me, what that means is connection manifesting. So I think the most healing aspect of both aromas and psychedelics is really that we're more connected to each other and more connected to nature. So just something to think about, but definitely an area of synergy. I hope I wasn't talking too fast. I think I still have a little time. Just practically, I want to talk about intentions. This is a picture I took of a bee just loving. Now I'm having a senior moment what that flower is, but just that deep intoxication, that deep bliss, that being in the moment that this bee is embodying. We're all capable of that, and let's just remember that. Just on a practical level, we only work with scent strips. I have a scent strip right here. They're also called perfumes test strips. We send them to clients, but you can get them on Amazon. And the nice thing is when you're working with psychedelic setting, it's easier than working with the bottle. You can't spill it. It's plenty. It creates a really nice cloud of scent because smelling from the bottle I always feel like looking at a painting through a straw. And then you can very easily, if you don't like the smell, or when I used to administer ketamine, I'd see people usually in the second half of their journey. In the first half, they would just recline, I'd rest it here, and then at some point they'd sort of pick it up, move it closer, move it further away. And then if you're working in a group or if you have clients scheduled back to back, you can, if you use a diffuser, the whole room is filled with the aroma. And one person might say, I can't even smell that. And someone else saying, this is way too much. So diffusers are very overwhelming. I wouldn't use them. The other thing is that most diffusers use water or heat, which can both chemically alter the composition of essential oils. So scent strips, you get the oil, nothing else. They're very convenient. So that's what I recommend. I think in my work, it evolved, it's not the right way, but I like using or recommending aromas based on the client's intention. I used to sort of let clients smell a few oils and pick one, and that's fine too. I'm not saying I'm right, but I find if someone has a particular intention for their journey, suggesting aromas based on that can be really helpful. The question is, what if the client doesn't like the oil? And again, the opposite of loving a scent isn't hating a scent, but really not being able to smell it. I think both saying, oh, I love this scent, or like, wow, this scent really triggers me, I don't like it, are both interesting avenues of exploration. Of course, sometimes clients are like, no, there's no way I'm going to smell this. I want something else. That's okay. You can work with the same essential oil over and over again because they're really allies. They're really holistic teachers. They teach you many different things. I actually we developed a psychedelic therapy support kit of 5 essential oils that I found are sort of the master allies. We'll talk about it more in a bit, but it contains rose, labdanum, which I mentioned earlier for shadow work. It mentions galbanum, which really helps people commit to the path. The galbanum, interestingly, not the essential oil, but the resin is one of the ingredients in the cataract formula that I mentioned. It includes helichrysum, which allows us to access long repressed feelings, tears we never allowed ourselves to cry. So really good for helping people access childhood emotions. And then in the kit is also vetiver, which we call rucus, which is the Indian name for the wild rucus, the wild vetiver. And that's really mostly for landing, for coming back. It helps you really get grounded and reconnected to your body. Um, just briefly, when I gave ketamine, I always gave it intramuscular. It's a very brief experience, 45, 50 minutes. And I think 1 or 2 oils, 1 or 2 scents is sufficient for that. You can use the same scent over and over again. I've certainly had clients who just want to work with one scent over and over again. I think, again, the picking the oil should really be based on your own practice with it, your own smelling it, so that you have this holistic, intuitive connection that guides your understanding, your connection, and the oil will really intuitively come to you. And of course, it's good to have some practical knowledge too. The quality is extremely important, and it's always better to work with fewer oils and really develop that relationship instead of having too many and not really having that connection. For psilocybin, the experience is longer, 4 to 6 hours, let's say. I would say that in those cases, you could use multiple aromas, but I would say only 1 or 2 at a time. And again, there may be an intention the client has beforehand. And then again, it's mostly about not interrupting the experience, but sometimes they'll sort of say, well, here's what's going on for me, and you can pick an aroma based on that. But it's really about allowing their unconscious process. And so again, one doorway to a whole nother topic is that Jung was fascinated by the alchemical stages because they're really a framework for the natural processes of the unconscious psyche. So when people invoke the term innate healing intelligence, I mean, that term has been, I think, very importantly explored. But what I think one meaning of it that's an important meaning is really trusting our unconscious, and what comes up in our unconscious may not be what our ego mind thinks should come up or wants to come up. So then if we recognize the natural processes, I think we're more prepared to guide clients through them. I mentioned the collective unconscious. And the other thing in my work, both with and without psychedelics, but definitely with aromas, it's once you pay attention to it, the impact and power of transgenerational ancestral traumas and patterns is just mind-boggling. Like once you start asking, well, what happened with your parents, grandparents? Many people's traumas or patterns, unconscious patterns, are really like not instant replay, but they're often in these ruts that didn't start with them. So that's a whole nother doorway to a whole nother conversation. We talked about intentions. I think one good use is, I think for those of you familiar with psychedelic work, often people really resist it, and you consider sort of stuck. They're stuck in the ego. Their ego has a hard time surrendering. And the essential oils really just ease people in. It's like the essential oil sort of puts its arm around your shoulder and says, come on in, the water's fine. Let's go there. And again, if you want to dig deeper, unconscious issues, status issues. I know that's a Jungian term. Often we don't know what they are, and the aromas can really say, okay, what's ready to come up now? Not everything all at once, obviously, but I think the aromas really facilitate that door opening to the unconscious. We mentioned the alchemical stages already. And then there's this notion of grace. I know grace has a particular religious meaning, but it's really when we're in a very difficult place, when we're really struggling. Grace is sort of this idea that we're not alone, that there is some greater power. You could call it the self with a capital S, the Atma, and the innate healing intelligence, the divine. But I think certain aromas really allow us in these moments of great suffering that sometimes we need to go through on our way to healing. Something comes in and reminds us, it brings grace. Again, maybe that's a term that needs to be further developed. And again, you can use aromas before, you can practice with them, to help people really practice surrendering, practice being more authentic, practice sort of snapping out of ego, obviously during the session and especially afterwards. I mean, people would do this spontaneously when I give them sense strips during ketamine work. They take them home, put them in a Ziploc bag, and a very obvious downside of these sense strips is the aroma dissipates very quickly, even if you put it in a Ziploc bag. But clients really were very attached to their scents. And then when I did ketamine group a couple of years ago, people were honestly more interested in what scent they were going to get to smell than what dose of ketamine they were going to get. So again, there's just this deep relearning how to smell, reconnecting that sense facilitate in the context of psychedelic therapy. That's just an overview. Intentions, well, let's talk about it. But what is an intention? An intention is really, to me, in a nutshell, sort of a humble request by the ego for the humble and the unconscious to get on the same page, saying, well, I'm ready to receive, I'm ready to get on the same page. What are the issues I need to pay attention to now? Ego-based intentions usually don't work that well in psychedelic therapy and don't really work that well in aromas. We sort of have to trust the wisdom of the situation. How to pick an oil, again, I think based on intention, based on your own relationship, smell the oils, get to know them, so that as you know how they change you, what they bring up in you, you sort of have this holistic sense. So this is the ally for this situation. And that really means committing to our own processes, our own wounded healer's journey. But on the other hand, there are certain oils that are really the masters of certain themes, and it's always better to have fewer than too many. I just want to quickly touch on this, and then maybe we'll open the floor for questions. So based on my reading of Jung and other people, this is a model that I sort of synthesized that I call the concentric circles. I don't know how well you can see it, but the second smallest circle is the physical body, then the emotional body, then the mental body, the spiritual body, then the collective. And then all of it together is really the self with a capital S. And ego consciousness, as you can see, it's grayed out and dashed. So our ego consciousness obviously attached to our body. This is me right now, here today, not 10 years ago, not 10 years in the future. There's certain emotions I'm feeling that I feel, and it's hard to snap out of them. There's certain mental patterns I'm in. So the ego consciousness touches some of these areas, but most of the psyche is outside. So most of the psyche is in the shadow. Again, that's a Jungian term. The conscious sense of self, you could say, is the persona, another Jungian term. I mentioned let's not get into anima and animus. And so our wounded healer's journey and the opportunity is really for this dashed line to become more porous, so that we're more open to more of ourselves, to all these parts of ourselves that's in the unconscious. I think aromas can do that. I think psychedelics can do that. But I think we need to have sort of a roadmap or an awareness of what we're experiencing, where it comes from. And this is where I'd say it comes from. Obviously, it interacts with the clients. I kind of want to stop here. The term wounded healer was actually coined by Jung. We can talk about it in the Q&A. I just want to mention this. I think this is cool. So this is a detail of the Hildesheim altarpiece, which is this altar in a medieval church in Germany. And there's been old books about it, and then more recent books about, if you look at the background, it looks like the top of a fly agaric, and the fly agaric has a long tradition of being used as a psychedelic. And so the idea is that the story of Adam and Eve is kind of the Christian version of McKenna's stoned ape hypothesis, that when Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, it was actually a psychedelic experience that shifted their awareness. Again, there, yeah, I mean, there are different cultural versions of this myth. Again, the stoned ape hypothesis, I think, is a more recent one. And there's a line in the gospel somewhere saying, I put the Latin, which of course wasn't the original language, and you will be, so when you eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge, you will be like God and know good and evil. And I think that this blind optimism, this mandatory optimism that's very common in the psychedelic field, should be tempered by the fact that we will know good and evil, and we need to be aware of that. This might be a good point for to put the links in the chat, and I'll send you the slides. But I wrote a free guide that you can download. I mentioned that's a blog post I wrote about oils, and we also developed this kit of 5 essential oils with an in-depth manual. That's really a great place to start. And if you want to go deeper, it's the last thing I'll share. We are doing an online class on May 3rd and 4th. So online means we'll mail you a kit of oils wherever you are. And then when we're smelling, even though we're meeting on Zoom, by smelling, we're sort of in the same place. I also meet now twice a month. We gather for free on Zoom to talk about aromas and psychedelics. That's on the website. Let me turn my slides off. I'm sorry, I've had you made you stare at these slides for so long, but I think now is probably a good time to open it for questions and give people and I'm sorry if I talked too fast. I'm just really excited about this work.
I think you covered so much territory. I think everyone's going to find something that was amazingly interesting. In fact, my first question to you, and there's a few questions already in the Q&A box that we'll bring up in a moment, but has anyone, you listed a lot of research. This is the research part of me and the scientist part of me and the doctor part of me speaking, but has anyone ever done a full systematic review on the uses of scents and all these aromas that you talked about in? Has anyone ever done a systematic review? I'm just thinking for all the PhD students out there looking for a project.
Yeah, well, there's bits and pieces. So I went very fast, and I apologize, but I'm excited about this subject. Sometimes researchers will pick a particular essential oil like rose, which again, there's a long spiritual tradition of rose symbolism. And so they'll say, oh, rose has been studied in all these settings. A lot of essential oil research, unfortunately, is mostly it's antifungal, antibacterial, because those are easy to do in vitro in petri dishes. We're doing research on the psychological effects of essential oils. There are some studies, they're rarer, and then there's a few review articles across the years, but they're not as in-depth as I'd like. Sometimes, again, it's a single aroma, single essential oil across different indications. Sometimes it's like, oh, this oil is good for that. No, that oil is good for that. But that's not really a review article. And then, again, in terms of the synergy, a lot of people are just, we don't even have a word for. People are blind to the importance of scent, and blind is a visual word. Anosmia is not a very nice word. It's very jargony. But I think we're very unconscious about our sense of smell, and that's reflected in how people are studying it. There's very few scent researchers and even fewer people trying to show how relevant, important it is, and how it can be applied to psychedelic therapy.
Mhm. And it's actually I'm so glad that you and your partner are doing so much more work around this, because when I think simply about trauma and in dealing with trauma and PTSD, let's say if like for a car accident, as an example, quite often people will recall so many parts of it. They'll remember the sounds, they'll remember what they saw, they'll remember optics of it, and they'll remember the smell. Like, oh, I smelled gas, or I smelled burning. oil. And so there's all these elements, of as we peel the layers and people resolve their traumas, that it certainly makes sense that our olfactory sense are incredibly important in also the healing part of when we're working with psychedelics.
Absolutely. And I mean, your example years ago, I was working at the VA and I had a client who, I mean, it's trigger warning, but he was a young soldier in Vietnam. And he's like, to this day, I can't have barbecue because it reminds me of the smell of burning flesh. So again, over the years, and that's, a lot of the interventions for PTSD are really around the abnormal memory. In a way, normal memory, it fades into the background, and PTSD is often like too detailed. Even Jung himself said that you can't really, when people have like nightmares related to a trauma, you can't really do Jungian dream analysis because it's too reality, it's too rigid, the memory never changes. But the role of scent in that, as far as I know, has really not been explored. And other examples of people don't know what triggers them, but it might be, if they were abused by someone, it might be a smell that reminds them of them, or the example you mentioned. So I think that we need to be much more honoring of that and mindful of that. And I think when we give people permission to talk about it, I think then it can be made, when we're unconscious of things, they rule us. And when we make it conscious, we
Mhm.
have a chance to change it.
Right. And I see this also in the positive. We often, when we're working with psychedelic medicines and therapies, we're often using positive things to anchor people too, right?
Yes.
You may say, when you're having a tough day, have two or three memories that really always bring a smile to your face, and that can help
Hmm.
bring, you back into feeling that way. Whereas with sense, we could also be doing that, if somebody has a very positive, like, this smell reminds me of my grandmother, and that could be
Yes.
something that could pull somebody forward in their healing process if they have this
Yeah.
positive anchor to move forward.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had. I'm not trained in the MDR, but I had friends who were trained in the MDR who would, part of the MDR is the anchoring stage, and using sense is really powerful. And I've certainly, in a non-EMDR way, when people would be really triggered, used sense in the office to bring them back to the here and now, and given people sense so that they're empowered, that if they go sort of down the PTSD rabbit hole, they can snap out of it by smelling a scent, so that there's a sense of there's something I can do. And the scent shifts me out of that rut, because again, PTSD will cause certain patterns in the default mode network. So absolutely, it's not just,
Mhm.
you know, that's what I like about it, that it's not so just pathology focused and limiting. When you give people a psych medication, the implicit message is, you're so messed up, you need to be on medication, or I'm so messed up, I need to be on medication. And that's a very disabling message. Whereas I think that when we can access resiliency through scent and other ways, it gives really people a sense of, I can do this. And I think that's, when people lose that I can do this, that's when things get really bad, when they're really disabled.
Mhm. Right, right. Just it's one more way of anchoring empowerment and moving towards healing. And two of the sense, I mean, I think anyone that's ever been had the opportunity to be in Peru and have an experience with ayahuasca will forever remember Agua de Florida and Palos.
Yes.
I mean,
Well,
you can't ever smell those again and not imagine and immediately know why they bring back a memory.
yes. And again, I think it's more than, I mean, obviously there's memories that are very powerful, as you just shared, as Bruce talked about, but I think it's also the innate, and yeah, there can be sort of a synergistic power. This reminds me of that, but I think, I'll be honest with you, I used to love Palo Santo essential oil, and you can get it, but I'm concerned because to get the highest quality oil, the trees have to be dead on the ground for 20 years. And so
Mhm.
to me, that's not a sustainable business model. And I've seen Palo Santo soap and Palo Santo incense sticks. I'm just like, we need to be much more respectful. So Palo Santo, I made a decision a while ago. I don't want to talk about it, teach about it, because if I talk about it, it incentivizes people to get it. And I think we just need to give Palo Santo a break. At the
Mhm.
same time, there isn't anything that smells like it. And agua de Florida is, traditionally it was this floral concoction, beautiful. And then there is now often I've heard or come across agua de Florida that's uses synthetics and is very sort of mixed together. So, and that happens a lot even in India, where we get some of our essential oils from. The bulk of the industry has moved to adulteration and synthetics, and the real craftspeople are few and far between because it's just hard to compete in that. Anyway, I don't mean to get too melancholy, but yeah, scent connects us
Well, I
to
think that's
just,
an important point, because a colleague of mine who is in this world deeply for a very long time, when they went through all the oils I had, was very quickly divvying them between, this one's off, this one's crap, this one's quality.
yes,
And you mentioned that a number of times about small batch, that
yeah,
it matters. So I wonder, in your practice, how much, I mean, obviously you are involved in curating very quality oils, but how does that matter? I mean, I'm
absolutely.
sure it
I mean,
matters. Sorry, I know it matters,
yes.
but what do you see when, if somebody gets like a knockoff, or something that is completely synthetic versus something that
I
is
think that's a really important question. So there's many layers. The first thing is that synthetics and even mass-produced essential oils are simply dead. You know, so this gold standard in the essential oil world is what's called the GCMS, gas chromatography mass spectroscopy. It gives you a chemical analysis of the constituents. And really good adulterers now will adulter not for the smell, they've done that for decades, but they'll adulter so that the GCMS looks convincing.
Mm,
But for me, I mean, this is why do we have a sense of smell? If I smell a natural essential oil from a plant, it moves me. Some of them will make me cry, they'll shift. And that's what I'm looking for. That soul to soul connection, that being moved is so much more important. The other place my mind wants to go, well, so let's talk a little bit. So mass-produced oils, they'll often say, okay, we're going to distill this oil for X hours, let's say 2 hours. And often the very tiny molecules that only come out if you distill in the same process for 6 hours bring that aliveness. But the mass producers are like, no, we're cutting it off at 2 hours, another 4 hours of is not economically feasible. So you have these oils that are not the fingerprint of the plant, and these small molecules play a big role. And then there's the process. Some essential oil companies will fractionate, so they'll have a giant vat of limonene, a giant vat of pinene, and then reconstitute them so that every batch of essential oil is exactly the same. But it almost sounds like Frankenstein to reconstitute. And and I think synthetic aromas, which there's plenty of more and more, but I think synthetic aromas are in no small part to blame for when people talk about being sensitive to aromas. I mean, aromatic molecules, some of them can be irritating to the skin, some of them can cause photosensitivity, but the sort of allergic reaction, usually you need larger molecules. I mean, pollens aren't molecules, but larger structures that trigger the allergy. But I would say that certain synthetic molecules just aren't good for us. There's one question in the chat or in the
yeah,
Q&A
yeah,
that
go
I
ahead,
saw. Yeah.
go for it. Yep, go ahead.
Are TARs responsible for the synesthesia that can sometimes occur? The honest answer is I don't know. I think that's more sort of a brain network event. So I think the piriform cortex and possibly other areas are probably responsible for synesthesia. I bet money that the piriform cortex is involved in synesthesia. Um, I'm not aware of any research. I mean, synesthesia is already a very rare event that's rarely studied, but I would look at it more at the level of the brain network than the receptor. That's my 2 cents.
Would you, I have two things. One, when you work with groups with sense, how they all use the scent stick, so
Yes.
they're not generally smelling each other's sticks, or how do you deal with that, especially if you have people, like there are some people that will walk into a room and will smell a scent at the
Yes.
far corner. How do you work with groups then for with the
Well, that's an excellent question. And, I think groups are getting more popular. And, a lot of traditional environments for group, Native American church meetings, ayahuasca circles. And in those settings, usually everybody smells the same scent. If you throw cedar on the fire or Palo Santo or Agua de Florida. When I've done group work with ketamine, it was all the same route so that people had more or less the same time duration. And we talk about everybody's individual intention and pick an aroma based on the individual intention. But group intentions emerged. And, the group in the psychedelic space is already a shared experience. Many people in group would say, I could never imagine doing this alone.
Mhm.
And the interesting thing, the last time I did group was 2 years ago, and it was just at the beginning of the Ukraine war. And these people here in northern New Mexico, many of them had this very warlike imagery, of tanks and, pretty gory stuff. And I think in the collective, whether you're by yourself or in a group of 10 people, you're tapped into the collective and you feel it. The other example is around that time, a big wildfire broke out near here. And I mean, that was a little more obvious because we were all worried about it spreading to our town. But
Mhm.
people also had these very fiery experiences in their psychedelic journeys. So again, the collective, not just the human collective from, in that case, Ukraine, but also sort of nature, all these layers of the collective, of the transpersonal realm are present. We can't deny them. So I think in that regard, when sometimes people will have similar intentions and they'll have similar aromas, but when smelling each other's aroma, I mean, with the scent strip, the scent, you can really control how much you're smelling it, even if you hold it at arm's length. And so if you're in a room and the other person's not that close to you, they barely smell it. But I think what it does to your psyche is going to spill over into their psyche. And I think then certain group intentions or group processes emerge. There's certain emergent phenomena, let's say. So I think that's just the nature of this kind of work, that we are like the trees are the roots of the tree are in the ground. We're rooted in the collective unconscious, and the aromas connect us more. They open doors. I think it's that there's a certain inevitable degree of connectedness, and I think if people smell each other's aromas, that's just part of it. But I had one person who had multiple chemical sensitivities, and she had this. There's an acronym for it, but it's when you have systemic fungi, and she said, I mean, she had horrible symptoms, was basically trapped at home. She was under the care of a specialist in Albuquerque, and when we did ketamine work, she'd say no aromas, and that's the only person ever who said no aromas, and I respected that because she was just so sensitive to life. But everybody else always loved the aromas.
Would you mind running us through so people can get a bit better of a sense? Would
Yeah,
you run us through maybe a couple, 2 or 3 cases and some, some interesting
yeah,
outcomes or findings that, perhaps would
yeah,
be more normal for working with scents than when people are not incorporating scents
yeah.
into.
And let me. I don't want to spend time. I don't know what I mean. I can email you that I actually wrote a double case report about 2 cases where I worked with aromas that was published. But let me give you one example of a gentleman because it interfaces with intentions and sort of, I'm reminded of the quote by Stan Groff, where he said, when you work psychedelically, there's 3 wisdoms in the room: the client, the guides, and the medicines. And with aromas, there's really 4 wisdoms, because again, the aroma is really the wisdom of the plant. It's not, you know, and it's not as intentionally focused as, let's say, medications. But let me give you this example of this gentleman who I met him when he had just moved back to New Mexico. He had been living on the East Coast, and his trauma, to me, was quite legit. He was a computer programmer who modeled nuclear bomb detonations on the East Coast, including the city where he lived. So that, it's sort of this, you could say it's abstract. the related question is, do drone operators get PTSD? And I've certainly met drone operators, they're sitting here, their drones are flying in Iraq, but they get PTSD because they know what they're doing. And this gentleman, you could say, yeah, he was just sitting in front of a computer, but constantly for years of his career simulating nuclear bomb explosions did a number on him. And his long-term coping still based on childhood trauma was really over intellectualization. So he was a hyper rational guy, and through the ketamine and aromas, and we worked a lot with helichrysum, which I mentioned earlier. It's also called immortelle. It's called everlasting or immortelle because the flowers don't wilt. It's a shrub. It's most famously in Corsica, Mediterranean. People will use it as a cultivar in their gardens. And the oil on a physical level is very good for bruises and sort of physical traumas that we've sealed off. And in the same way, psychologically, often we seal off, especially childhood things. We're too young to process them. So we seal them off and then they're tucked away for years and decades. And the helichrysum, in the same way, it releases the physical bruises, will, bless you, access the psychological bruises. And so this guy really got in touch with his feelings. And his intention at the beginning was really, I want to reconnect with my dad, who was the source of the trauma, and I think the reason why he moved to the East Coast as a young man. But along the way, in a way, the wisdom of the plants, the wisdom of the ketamine, the wisdom of his unconscious said to him, you got to get more in touch with your feelings before you can even begin to reconnect with your dad. You have to let go of this coping style you learned, this over-intellectualization. So it was a very holistic process. And then after we stopped working together, I was still in touch with the therapist he was seeing. His wife got diagnosed with cancer, and the report was that she reported, and he felt that he was much more present with his wife's illness than his over-intellectualization would have him previously permitted to be. So I thought that was very touching, that he was more connected to himself, to his wife. To me, that's a very holistic success story. Another lady where we worked a lot with Rose, different aromas too, but again, trigger warning. She came in, she was a nurse, depression, but it very quickly became apparent that she also had severe PTSD. As a young woman, as a teenager, preteen, she wanted to be a dancer, and her feet, there was something supposedly wrong with them. So she had foot surgery that was supposed to correct her feet so she could go on point in ballet. Surgery didn't work, and it meant that she could never dance. And to top things off, make matters worse, the surgeon sexually molested her. So she had this long buried trauma, and in the work with the ketamine and with the aromas, and really, I was just rereading her case. It was a couple of years ago, but there's a lot of Rose, and Rose is really about sort of opening the heart. When traumas close our heart, when traumas make us cut off, because the word trauma really means cut. I mean, all aromas really as the molecules of connectedness, but in particular, Rose Otter just really made her feel more whole, and actually gave her, this was during COVID, and she was working as a nurse, and she said everybody's just freaking out, and she was made to work extra shift, and in a way that was her survival skill, was instead of being a dancer, doing what her soul wanted to do, she figured out this really, you could say, codependent way of a career of pleasing others. And the ketamine work and the aromas really gave her permission to say, you know what, I'm going to retire because that's what I need, to reconnect with her own needs was really, really important to her. And so I'm more interested in sort of these holistic shifts than it relieved anxiety. I mean, I had one guy with OCD, and again, ketamine and aromas. I mean, his OCD was terrible. He was starving himself because he thought the food might be poisoned. The spaghetti sauce was blood. I mean, almost psychotic. And it really worked for a while. And, so that's maybe a little more symptom oriented, but
I'm
I'm more
curious more
interested in.
about that. Have you found? I mean, that is a condition. OCD is a condition that, some people are lucky and it does really respond nicely to ketamine therapy. But I'd be curious to know if there are certain scents, if that, have you come across that, or is it still very individual?
I mean, I would always say individual. I'm very leery of saying, oh, lavender is good for this indication and this oil is good for that. That's, I really want to say that you should really introduce aromas in that same holistic way that psychedelics, there's a, when we require psychiatric diagnosis for psychedelic work, I mean, on the one hand, it's understandable, but on the other hand, it means that people have to sort of accept the diagnosis and conform. I haven't looked at his case in a while. I don't remember the oils, but I think, again, electrism for sure, because I think he was really out of touch with a lot of the long repressed feelings. Um, um, sorry, I'm mixing two cases. There was another young man who was really undecided. Like it's, I think it's not a diagnosis, but this idea of failure to launch, is really stuck. And we used a lot of galbanum with him. And galbanum, again, is the resins and the cataract. Now there's an essential oil of it. And galbanum has a lot to do with committing to the path. When you're like, oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I want to do this or that. I can't decide. Galbanum is like, come on, let's go. So galbanum is used in Europe a lot to help people with substance abuse to say, that's it, I'm quitting, I'm sober. And in this gentleman's case, and that's not the OCD guy, but I think we used galbanum with him too. This gentleman who was struggling with commitment through the galbanum, he realized, I love baking bread. And then he ended up getting a job in a bakery. You could say duh, but at least he was living his soul's purpose. The gentleman with the OCD, I think one thing, at least if I remember the way I looked at it with his OCD, there was something about being in a body that was really anxiety provoking to him. And, most of his obsessions were around food. And so I want to make sure I have time for any other question, but sometimes being in our body is actually a really scary place. And sometimes the only way we can allow ourselves to be in our body is in a psychedelic experience. And that's where then, even though I said earlier I would use vetiver at the end for the landing coming back, sometimes the only way people who are prone to dissociation, and I would say certain forms of OCD, when you're like, you don't want to be here, you've survived by dissociating, by being in a very small part of your psyche, cut off, like a head in the clouds. Having an experience of embodiment, which the vetiver gives you, like, oh, it's safe to be in my body, I love my body. Sometimes the only way to safely access that is in a psychedelic space, like with ketamine. And then you can build on that and say, wow, it's okay to be embodied, and I can be embodied outside the psychedelic space.
Yeah.
There's one other question in the Q&A, and then if any other questions, but do I ever use scents that are native to Mexico? Well, yes, we used to have a small still, and then a year ago, well, yeah, March, we bought a larger still, about 70 gallons. And so now when we collect local plants, pinon, sagebrush, alligator juniper, other types of juniper, chamisa, which is also called rabbit brush, snakeweed, we have essential oils of them. And they're really powerful. A lot of people who like essential oils, common things are common, popular things are popular, and these oils are not well known because there aren't people making them except us. But they're really powerful, and I think it has something to do in this harsh desert, high desert climate. I think many plants survive by making essential or making the constituents that we turn into essential oils. So that I don't have good words for it yet, but I think it has something to do with the plant's survival and the lessons they can teach us through the aromas.
And that says a lot about being in right relationship with the land of which you are upon, too,
Yes, absolutely.
and what's there. Well, this has been absolutely delightful. I think you have piqued a lot of interest. You've given us a lot of science. You've given us some stories, some case reports. I don't know if you want to throw up your connect slide one more time, or we can add that to the show notes.
Gordon put it in the chat, so everybody. I think you
Can get it all.
sometimes you, yeah, and I could share the slides with you, and then people have it.
Wonderful.
But there is a free guide that you could sign up for and get. There's the psychedelic therapy support kit, which we mail all over the world. And then if you want to delve deeper, we're teaching a live online class on the weekend of May 3rd and 4th. So those are my obvious next steps, what I would recommend. So they're in the chat. You can screenshot the chat at the worst, and I can send you the slides and follow-up links.
Wonderful. Thank you. We'll post that with the show notes. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you for sharing some space with us tonight. And until next time.
Until next time, thank you for having me. And my only regret is that we couldn't smell oils together, which we can't do in this setting. But the
One day it
molecules
will
of
be possible.
connectedness, yes, well, hopefully with natural aromas. But in spite of not being able to smell, the molecules of connected us. They brought us together. So
Indeed.
thank you, everybody. Thanks for letting me share what I'm passionate about. And yeah, you can always email me, and hopefully I'll see some of you further on down the line. Thank you, Pam.
No, my pleasure. Thank you so much. Everyone, have a wonderful day.
Bye.